Hi, I'm Sean. I'm a study skills tutor based in Bristol for DBS. I'm also a freelance musician and lecturer. And today we are understanding neurodiversity in the music industry. I'm going to go over a range of topics in this video, exploring how neurodiversity presents in the industry, understanding some of the limits and limitations that neurodivergent people may experience in the music industry, and looking at some strategies and forms of self-advocation that people can use to navigate this. First thing I want to unpack is what neurodivergence actually is, and within that, where it fits within neurodiversity. You'll likely have heard the terms neurodiversity or possibly even neurodivergence and neurotypical before, but it's important to understand how they intersect with each other. Neurodiversity is a collective term for all neurotypes. That is, all of the different ways our brains work. Our brains all work in different kind of capacities and can present themselves with fantastic abilities and other things that may challenge us when we interact with the world at large. Neurodiversity is the umbrella term in that regard. Neurotypicality is a term we use to understand what would once have been considered normal. We don't really use that term anymore because it's not particularly useful. Instead, we use neurotypical for brains that align with what would be typically expected of a person, and neurodivergent for people who diverge from that tendency. If we look at this graphic here, we can see a range of different neurodivergences. You'll likely have heard of some of these terms. This is a non-exhaustive list. There are many other forms of neurodivergence. These are the big ones that come up, certainly in study skills work. At the top left and right, we have dyslexia and dyspraxia. These tend to be the two people are most familiar with. Dyspraxia, also referred to as DCD, which is developmental coordination disorder. Now, in many ways, we can think about neurodivergence as almost like a negative thing. There's a lot of sort of stigma that are attached to these conditions. However, when we unpack it, we notice there are also many capacities that would be considered possibly greater than you'd expect in a neurotypical comparison. So in the case of people who have dyspraxia, they often have developed verbal skills and greater sense of empathy. And similarly with dyslexia, we see a lot more visual thinking and a lot more kind of creative capacities. We're going to reflect in a moment on how this might impact someone as they navigate through the music industry. Alongside this, we notice the autism and ADHD diagnoses, where people with these kind of diagnoses may experience greater concentration and may have more creative and hyper-focusing skills. This is where they're able to focus on things for extended periods of time, certainly things that they are passionately connected to, and are able to achieve quite a lot within that kind of capacity. Within this, we also have mental health. Certainly when we observe neurodivergence through the social model, we consider anxiety, depression, and other mental health considerations part of that umbrella. And within that, we have considerations for a greater depth of thinking and a lot more expression, which obviously aligns itself quite positively when we consider musicians. We also have Tourette syndrome. So people with Tourette syndrome can be highly creative, have a lot of observational skills. And at the bottom, we have acquired neurodiversity. This may not be something you've heard of before. It's generally someone who has developed neurodiversity as a response to some kind of trauma, whether emotional or physical. And in these cases, we often see an increased amount of empathy, something I'm sure you can imagine is necessary for composing music or for creating art in some capacity. Now that we've reflected on some of these diagnostic types, it's important to consider how these traits can then present themselves. Not everyone is going to have a diagnosis, and in fact, actually, a diagnosis isn't always helpful. Neurodivergence can present itself in many different ways, many different forms, so it's more valuable to look at how these neurodivergent traits can present in someone. One of the key ones you may have noticed is differences in reading. When we imagine a dyslexic person, we imagine they're going to struggle with text on different backgrounds, text with different fonts, and this could impact on how they may experience sort of posters or advertising or other linguistic oriented things in the music industry. I imagine emails and other forms of admin are an important consideration. We also consider working memory, which is the ability to remember lots of tasks and have lots of things actively working in one's mind at the same time. If you imagine all the things a musician may go through in a day, all of the sequencing, all of the organization they need to do, this could be impacted in some way negatively by having a diagnosis that impacts working memory. For instance, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD. There's also phonological processing. So that's processing what has been said. So verbal communication. If you can imagine being in a situation where you've just shown up to a music venue or a club for the first time, and you're asking what the expectations of you are or what's going to happen once you get there, there may be a lot of expectations on you that are delivered verbally. And if you have a phonological processing difference, this may become more difficult for you. Equally, considerations need to be made for organisation. Organisation fits into what we call the executive functions. People with most forms of neurodivergence will experience a difference in the executive functions. So specifically, people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, and autism can be affected in this regard. Equally can people with trauma. And if you are struggling with organisation, there are lots of strategies out there that can support you. Certainly looking at digital strategies like using Google Calendar or other calendar systems, perhaps analog calendars if they're useful to you. Another difference, of course, is attention and focus. So when we think about people with ADHD and autism, as discussed before, they can experience hyperfocus, which can be really beneficial in allowing them to focus on one thing for a sustained period of time. If you imagine coming close to a deadline, and you have to have a remix submitted by a certain point in time, that hyperfocus may kick and allow you to get you a lot more work done in a shorter period of time. Spatial processing can also be affected and can affect people both in attendance and people playing at gigs, events, DJing, etc. If you think about the size of a space and the amount of people that can occupy it, the differences in spatial processing may render it difficult for someone to move from point A to point B. These are things that need to be considered when we consider live music events. Of course, coming along with all forms of audio processing is sensory processing. If you imagine a music event where there's lots of loud noises, there's lots of people talking, there's potentially flashing lights, there could be an incredibly warm environment. These are all things that may impact people who have sensory differences and sensory processing issues. Certainly people who are autistic or ADHD will be affected in that way. But you yourself may notice that you have certain sensory needs that are challenged when you enter into a live music space. The last two things I want to look at are social understanding and emotional regulation. So if someone has differences in social understanding, they may find a live music event more challenging purely because of the amount of social expectation that goes into setting up or applying to play an event, or even simply being at an event and being surrounded by all of those people. All of these things factor into our emotional state. These things can become incredibly overwhelming, and as such, being able to regulate your emotions, to control how you're feeling, and to ensure that you are grounded and in a regulated place can become difficult. As you can see, there are a range of traits that can impact someone who is trying to navigate the music industry. We're going to look now at a range of strategies that can be used to support people who are experiencing differences that would impact them in that way, and explores ways of making the music industry more accessible to them. So one of the areas that may be impacted is one's time management and organizational skills. So if we consider setting up the sets, performing at live performances, touring, travel, and making sure you actually have time to sit down and work on your production outside of all of the administrative demands of you. Things to consider are how you actually perceive time to some extent. Are you someone who is motivated by daily goals? Do you prefer more weekly goals? Would you prefer to have a sort of paper calendar or a more digital calendar? Something where you can see time in front of you and you can manage where that goes. Digital strategies are of course helpful because they're more flexible. You can move the events around on Google Calendar to show where things are going to happen or how you're getting on with things. Equally, having just it all set out can help you feel less anxious, knowing that all of the ideas in your head are actually on a piece of paper somewhere and you can come to them when you're ready. Equally, other administrative things in the forms of invoices, emails, contracts can be really difficult for people who are struggling with processing, reading or writing in any capacity, and also people who just find these tasks boring and find it very difficult to show up for. One thing to consider is body doubling. If you and your musician friends are struggling with this, getting together and working on different things in the same room can be really helpful. It introduces the idea of having someone to communicate with, and sometimes just the knowledge that you can have a friendly interaction is enough to remove the need for it, and can be very valuable in making sure those invoices are sent in and you get paid on time. Sensory processing at events can be slightly more difficult to navigate and manage. One thing I would advocate for if I was in your position, someone showing up to play an event, be it a gig or a club night, having a quiet space that you can decompress in before and after, especially if you struggle with public transport in any capacity and your tour is reliant on you traveling from place to place in a manner that is going to be stressful. Also can be really valuable just to get away from people for a moment to process how you're feeling before you go on stage and present that to everybody else. Another area that can be difficult is sleep. Lots of neurodivergent people struggle with sleep, especially people with ADHD and autism, but it's generally a wider concern. One thing to consider is your routines that you have when you are at home and how you can implement those whilst you are touring, specifically around having a regular bedtime. Now, the time you go to bed at when you're touring may be very different to the time you go to bed at normally when you're at home, but if you can try and get at least 8 hours sleep a night where possible, and I appreciate that isn't always possible, that can be really valuable. And any routines you have before you go to bed, be it you have a hot drink of some nature or you have specific pajamas you wear, it can seem pedantic, but it can really help you when you are struggling with the road. Motivation is something that can be really hard to maintain whilst doing music. We're all here because we're passionate, let's be honest, but sometimes that passion can become overwhelming, and the issues around how you stay focused can become more present. Now, motivation can be really difficult for people who perhaps are playing on lineups where they don't look or aren't perceived as being similar to everybody else. In this regard, I'm thinking of people who are assigned female at birth, who are possibly playing in a lot of male-oriented spaces, and I'm thinking of people who are of people of colour coming into often very white-oriented spaces that can have a real detrimental impact, which can intersect quite viciously with neurodivergence. So making sure that you've got a strong support network around you is really, really valuable in that situation, and trying to understand what is causing the change in motivation. Is it from an external factor or is it from an internal factor? There are many options available to support with that, but some of it is rooted in unpacking things perhaps with a therapist, and in some cases it's about exploring how the industry can change to fit you in it. Another manner is communication. There's a lot of communication that needs to happen when you are working as a musician. A lot of it is going to be email-based, and a lot of it is interfacing with people once you arrive at events. So if you struggle with communication, make sure you have some scripts pre-created, and these can exist in note files that can ease with sending emails. So if you have trouble with turning down an event you've been offered, or you have issues around being paid your fee and you find communicating that difficult, perhaps abstractly create a pro forma that you can just send automatically, so it reduces the need to think. Equally, if you are in a space with a physical human being and you're interfacing more directly, make sure you consider the things you might need to discuss before you enter that space, and take someone to one side and just explain to them how you're feeling in certain situations. And if you're touring with other people, allow them to support you when necessary if there's going to be struggles with how you're going to communicate. Now, we've considered a lot of the ways that the music industry can be hard for neurodivergent people to navigate. It's really important to reframe how we consider neurodivergence. If we consider that neurodivergence is someone's relationship with the world around them, and we observe what we would consider the social model, which observes that all people are right and correct in their own presentation, and actually it's how they relate to the world around them that they struggle with. We can then consider, okay, a lot of these things that are labelled negative may be problematic, and actually what we need to consider is how neurodivergence can present in very fortuitous ways. Many neurodivergent people are creative. Their kind of lateral thinking, creative brain is quite highly documented in people who are neurodivergent, which is a fundamental and important skill when working in the music industry, and can really help with thinking logically, but also laterally around certain pieces of music. So if you consider yourself a producer, the ability to think laterally can help you pull together ideas from different places, potentially even different genres, to create music that is new or has a sense of personality to it. We discussed previously hyperfocus and the ability of certain neurodivergent people to really focus on things that align with their passions in ways that enable them to create work incredibly quickly. And whilst the idea of creating work quickly isn't, in the name of art per se, it can be really valuable when you have a lot of things on your plate to be able to sit down and really get into the work itself and create something meaningful. Empathy is a fundamental skill, important for all human beings and for how we relate to one another, and of course is important in the creation of art. It's the ability to understand emotions, to understand feelings, and to be able to take that understanding and imbue it into something that someone else can appreciate, something that they can be moved by or experience in some capacity. And that can be in any musical form or in any artistic practice. And observing that in neurodivergent people, certainly through those who have had experiences that could be considered negative. A lot of neurodivergent people come through life having very negative experiences because of the neurotypical expectations placed upon them. This gives them that kind of understanding of the wider context of the world we live in many regards, which can have a very positive impact on how they create. And then verbal skills. Verbal skills is an area of capacity, as we mentioned before, with dyspraxic people, but can also be the case quite broadly with people with neurodivergence or who are neurodivergent, and can be very valuable in the creation of lyrics and sort of word-based concepts. I think as well as people who are musicians, but also poets, for example, in this regard. The ability to use language in a way that is emotive when it is combined with the empathy that we find with neurodivergent people, or the creativity, to creating a more lyric-oriented approach to making. I'd like to draw attention to a quote by a writer named Sunny Jane Wise. They exist on Instagram with the handle Lived Experience Educator, who talks quite extensively about neurodivergence and what neurodivergence is and what neurodivergence is not. And they have a phenomenal quote. Gentle reminder that you do not need a diagnosis to identify as neurodivergent at all. Neurodivergent exists outside the medical and pathology paradigm, so our understanding of neurodivergence must also exist outside of the pathology paradigm. Here I would advocate that anyone who wishes to identify as neurodivergent and resonates with what's being stated here should in fact identify as neurodivergent. It is your space to do so. The idea is you recognize that your brain works differently to that which we would expect with neurotypicality around perhaps communication or interaction or time management or sensory processing or emotional regulation, many of these things that have been discussed, and that you can identify as neurodivergent in that regard. So here we've unpacked a lot of neurodivergent traits, and we've explored how someone who is neurodivergent may struggle with accessing the industry. We've also explored many of the ways in which they may find advantage in the industry due to certain capacities around creativity, empathy, etc. I think there's a lot of conversation around how strategy can be used to help you access the kind of industry at large. But I think there's also a large conversation that needs to happen around how the industry can change to fit you into it too, if you are a neurodivergent person. If you are not a neurodivergent person and you are watching this, one thing I would ask you to consider is what could you do more to support someone who is neurodivergent in the music industry? We were discussing the idea of quiet spaces. So if you're a promoter, could you consider having a green room of some kind where someone can go and decompress, and the focus of the space is for them to have sort of disconnection time from expectations of being social, and to have somewhere quiet to go. Equally, if you're a friend of someone who struggles with the administrative side of being in the music industry, could you help them to understand body doubling? And could you share in the sort of space together where you sit down and work through your administration side by side? I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make the music industry more accessible, certainly around a lot of these sensory and social kind of contexts. And I think the more we can do to bring in this sort of understanding into these spaces, the more we can support neurodivergent people in being able to be musicians, to tour, and wider the conversations around how neurodivergence intersects with other areas of oppression, for instance, racial oppression or gender-oriented oppression. So as discussed, there are many ways that neurodivergence can impact someone's experience of the music industry, both positively and negatively. If you are a friend or an ally to someone who is neurodivergent, or equally you work within the industry itself, reflect on how you can make it more accessible to someone who struggles with time management and organisation, sensory overwhelm, who may experience emotional regulation issues in relation to accessing the industry. If you are considering that you may be neurodivergent based on what you've been reading recently or things that you've heard in this video, then consider that you can identify as neurodivergent without a diagnosis. It allows you to consider all of the ways in which your life experiences thus far have impacted your ability to be a musician perhaps, be in the industry, and all of the things that may have affected you thus far. There is lots to consider within the industry as far as neurodivergent goes, and making sure that neurodivergent people have access to the music industry. Of course, we know neurodivergence is one part of the story, neurotypicality is the other, and these two things combined form the neurodiversity understanding.